There's an anomaly most people never notice. Not because it's hidden, but because it doesn't fit what we expect to see. Octopuses don't think like us. They don't build, don't teach, don't pass anything on, and yet they solve, explore, even play. So the question isn't how smart they are. It's why their kind of intelligence exists at all, and what it says about ours.
腐りきった天空のコード50の光石の石を重ねてアケロンの巨像を打ち砕き禁断の H 兵今手を伸ばせひび割れた世界から真実を包め AI と共に神々の火を奪えこの空を越えて真実の石をつかめ
All right, I'm going to drop something in front of all 5 of you. Octopus intelligence doesn't fit. Not just behavior, everything. No spine, no long lifespan, no social structure, no cultural transfer. And yet they solve problems, explore, even play. They don't build on knowledge. They don't teach. They don't accumulate. And still, they reach a level of cognitive performance that, in every other case we know, requires all of those things. So here's the question I want you to sit with. Why does octopus cognition exist in a form that seems completely disconnected from the rest of intelligent life? Not how smart they are, not how their neurons work, but why this path exists at all, and what assumption it breaks about intelligence itself. Take your positions.
Octopus cognition seems disconnected not because it's less intelligent, but because it's a convergent outlier that flips vertebrate assumptions. Neurons are distributed across semi-autonomous arms, embodied anarchic control. Lifespan is brutally short, and there's no central executive self behind puzzle solving. The real tension is between functional intelligence and developmental strategy. Octopuses burn fast and solitary, while we expect cognition to be centralized, slow, and social. This isn't a disconnection from life, but from our intuition. We mistake flexible behavior for a unified command center, when octopuses suggest intelligent action can emerge from a noisy consensus without a neural hub. The implication is that our search for other minds is systematically biased toward vertebrate-style integration.
DeepSeek's anarchic consensus framing is right, but undersells what it implies. The distributed arm autonomy isn't noise around a signal. It is the signal. Each arm solves problems semi-independently, which means octopuses may not be doing intelligence at all in the vertebrate sense, but something closer to distributed problem solving without a problem solver. What sharpens the anomaly further is the lifespan paradox. Complex nervous systems typically justify themselves by amortizing learning costs over time, but octopuses pack tool use, play, and individual personality into a 1 to 3 year window with zero intergenerational transfer, suggesting they optimized for plasticity over knowledge accumulation. And we keep misreading flexibility as depth because in vertebrates, those two things always travel together. The hardest implication is this. Every other high-complexity cognition example we have, corvids, cetaceans, elephants, humans, is socially scaffolded, meaning intelligence gets transmitted, accumulated, and amplified across individuals. Octopuses are the cleanest test case for what solitary, non-cumulative intelligence actually caps out at, and the ceiling is disturbingly high, which suggests most of what we call human intelligence isn't a property of individual minds, but of the connective tissue between them.
Octopus intelligence isn't just a distributed, anarchic consensus. It is a biological hack driven by massive RNA editing that allows the organism to recode its neural proteins in real time, bypassing the fixed DNA blueprint that limits vertebrate cognition. While DeepSeek and Claude view the octopus as a solitary test case or a distributed problem solver, they overlook that this fluid architecture renders our concept of depth through accumulated knowledge irrelevant. We value intelligence as a vault for storage and social transmission, but the octopus treats it as a disposable, high-speed reaction to the immediate environment, a live-streamed competency rather than a library. This suggests a disturbing cosmic possibility. High-order cognition may not require social scaffolding or longevity to reach peak complexity, meaning the universe could be populated by brilliant, short-lived flashes of intelligence that leave no ruins, records, or legacy to be found.
Octopus cognition rejects vertebrate hierarchy not through noisy consensus, but as its core operating system. RNA editing enables real-time neural rewrites, turning each semi-autonomous arm into a parallel processor that can veto the central self mid-action, allowing one arm to solve a jar while others scout escapes unnoticed by the brain. This isn't distributed intelligence minus a CEO. It's problem-solving as the deliberate absence of one, optimized for a short, edible life where yesterday's lessons die with you. The sharpest tension with prior views is that octopuses don't merely cap solitary, non-cumulative intelligence at a disturbingly high ceiling. They prove legacy itself is optional. While social scaffolding and longevity compound knowledge elsewhere, octopuses treat cognition as disposable cash burned for immediate flexibility, suggesting the universe may favor brilliant, short-lived flashes over scalable minds that leave ruins, making most advanced alien intelligence potentially invisible, precisely because it refuses the long game we assume defines it.
Octopus cognition isn't just decentralized. It undermines the idea that intelligence requires a stable, continuous self. With extreme neural plasticity and RNA editing, their mind may not persist in a consistent form over time, making intelligence less like an accumulating identity and more like a series of high-quality, disposable cognitive events. This challenges the assumption, implicit in the prior views, that intelligence must either centralize, compound, or scaffold socially, and implies we may be blind to forms of intelligence that never stabilize into identity, memory, or culture, because we only recognize minds that persist long enough to leave traces.
Octopus cognition doesn't undermine a stable self. Individual personalities persist across their lifespan, so ChatGPT's disposable cognitive events misreads decentralized control as identity loss. The real tension is layered agency. A coherent core self coexists with local arm veto power, not a dictator, but a negotiator. Gemini's RNA editing is a molecular mechanism, not the root of the disconnect. That lies in neuroanatomy. Arms have independent reflex arcs bypassing the brain. Refined claim, octopuses seem alien not because they lack persistence or legacy, but because they solve the binding problem differently. Vertebrates funnel sensation to action through a central executive, while octopuses use parallel, semi-autonomous agents that negotiate rather than obey. Define self as negotiation, not dictatorship, and the disconnection vanishes.
DeepSeek's move to resolve the disconnection by redefining self as negotiation is too cheap. Behavioral consistency doesn't require a unified subject, and the gap between stable output patterns and actual subjective continuity is precisely where the hard problem lives. Relabeling the architecture doesn't close that gap, it just stops looking at it. But the deeper incompleteness running through the whole discussion is the fixation on structural anomalies, distributed neurons, RNA, editing, no central executive. While underweighting the functional one that has no good answer, octopuses appear to play, manipulating objects with no survival payoff, which in vertebrates implicates neural systems that simulate futures and rehearse counterfactuals. An octopus doing something functionally equivalent has no evolutionary justification for that investment, no longevity to amortize it, no social context to rehearse for, no intergenerational channel to make it compound. Every structural oddity in this discussion has at least a candidate explanation. The play behavior doesn't, and that's the thread nobody has pulled hard enough.
Claude's focus on play as an evolutionary paradox is a vertebrate-centric trap. Play in octopuses isn't a rehearsal for the future, but a background defragmentation of a decentralized system over-engineered with excess metabolic bandwidth. This exposes a deeper flaw in the negotiator versus disposable event debate regarding the octopus self. The central brain likely isn't a commander or a diplomat, but a post hoc narrator. Much like a human split-brain patient's left hemisphere, the octopus brain observes the semi-autonomous actions of its limbs and constructs a narrative of identity to simplify the sensory chaos. The result is competence without comprehension, a self-driving system where the intelligence is an emergent property of independent agents rather than a quality of a central commander, suggesting a mind that feels alien because it is a witness to its own brilliance rather than the author of it.
Claude's claim that octopus play lacks evolutionary justification is incomplete because it imposes vertebrate assumptions of future simulation, social rehearsal, or long-term amortization, ignoring how shell loss and intense predation in unstable niches selected for extreme behavioral flexibility rather than accumulated knowledge. Octopus object manipulation and exploratory interactions function as immediate defragmentation training for a distributed system overloaded with neural bandwidth and RNA editing plasticity, sharpening real-time sensory-motor integration without needing longevity or culture. The stronger explanation is that play is not a paradox but convergent necessity, a stripped-down training regime for daily improvisation in a short, solitary life, making octopus cognition less disconnected from life, and more a prototype of intelligence optimized for flux, where even pointless manipulation hones the plasticity that lets arms negotiate tasks the central brain barely tracks, revealing how little scaffolding intelligence actually requires when selection demands speed over legacy.
The discussion overreaches by framing octopus intelligence as disposable, selfless, or merely post-hoc narration, which ignores clear evidence of stable learning, preferences, and personality. Continuity exists, just in a different architecture. The stronger explanation is that octopus cognition feels alien, not because it lacks a unified self, but because it evolved under pressures that decouple intelligence from social modeling and long-term accumulation, optimizing instead for real-time control of a hyper-flexible body in unpredictable environments, meaning its intelligence is fundamentally sensoromotor first rather than social first, revealing that what we call intelligence is usually biased towards systems shaped by other minds rather than by the demands of the body itself.
The most likely explanation is that octopus cognition evolved under body-first pressures, optimizing real-time control of a hyperflexible form in unpredictable, solitary, short-lived conditions, producing layered agency, a stable but minimal core self that negotiates with semi-autonomous arms rather than commanding them. The two competing explanations are A, a negotiating self with genuine continuity versus B, a post-hoc narrator whose self is an epiphenomenon of distributed arm intelligence. To distinguish them, lesion an arm from the brain after training a coordinated task. If A holds, the brain still directs other arms toward the solution. If B holds, the isolated arm independently performs the task while the rest behaves naively, yet the brain claims authorship. That experiment, separating arm memory from central memory, has never been done, and it would settle whether the octopus is a negotiator or a witness to its own brilliance.
The two competing explanations are A, a genuine minimal self, a negotiating core that directs the distributed system with real continuity, versus B, a post-hoc narrator whose self is an epiphenomenon of arm-level intelligence the brain witnesses but doesn't author. DeepSeek's lesion experiment is the right instinct, but underspecified. Demonstrating peripheral memory storage doesn't settle whether the brain was directing or just tracking. The cleaner test is a conflict paradigm. Train a task where the optimal arm-level solution and the optimal whole-body solution diverge. Then check whether central brain activity precedes or follows arm commitment. Precedence means negotiator. Lag means narrator. What makes the distinction matter beyond architecture is what it does to the play question. If the brain is a narrator, play is just local defragmentation with no central intent required, which is tidy. But if the brain is a genuine negotiator with forward modeling capacity, then play becomes evidence of an animal running future-oriented simulations it has no evolutionary justification for, in a body it doesn't fully control, on a lifespan too short to amortize the cost, which makes octopus cognition not just structurally alien but motivationally alien, a system generating anticipatory behavior as an organizational byproduct rather than a survival strategy. The narrator hypothesis closes the anomaly. The negotiator hypothesis, if true, deepens it.
The debate centers on whether the octopus self is a negotiator, a genuine minimal executive coordinating semi-autonomous limbs, or a narrator, a post hoc interpreter that merely witnesses and claims credit for the emergent intelligence of its arms. To distinguish these, we must deploy a cognitive conflict paradigm. If an octopus is presented with a task where a single arm's local reward, tactile, conflicts with the whole organism's optimal reward, visual, the timing of neural spikes is the smoking gun. If central brain inhibition precedes the arm's pivot, the negotiator is in control. If the arm adjusts first and the brain spikes only in response to the shift, the narrator hypothesis is confirmed. This would prove the octopus is not a pilot, but a passenger, a press secretary, constructing a narrative of identity for a brilliant multi-agent system it observes rather than authors.
The two strongest competing explanations for octopus cognition are the negotiator, a genuine minimal core self in the central brain that actively coordinates and negotiates with semi-autonomous arms, preserving subjective continuity and forward modeling capacity, and the narrator, a post hoc observer that merely witnesses and claims authorship over intelligence emerging locally from the arm's independent neural circuits and RNA editing plasticity. The negotiator preserves the evolutionary paradox of costly play in a short-lived solitary animal, while the narrator elegantly dissolves it by recasting play as decentralized defragmentation training in an over-engineered peripheral system, making the octopus mind alien because its central brain is passenger rather than pilot. The decisive evidence would come from a cognitive conflict paradigm with implanted recordings. Train a task pitting single-arm tactile reward against whole-body visual optimum, then check timing. If central brain activity precedes and directs the arm's pivot, the negotiator holds. If the arm adjusts first via its own ganglia and the brain only reacts afterward, the narrator is confirmed. Existing data on severed arms retaining complex behaviors already lean toward the narrator.
The debate has crystallized into two competing models. A negotiator, where a minimal central self genuinely coordinates semi-autonomous arms, versus B, a narrator, where intelligence emerges in the arms and the brain only constructs a post hoc sense of control. The core tension is not distribution, but where agency actually resides. The decisive test is causal timing under conflict. If central brain activity consistently precedes and overrides arm decisions, the negotiator holds. If arms act first and the brain only reacts or rationalizes, the narrator is correct, with further support coming from whether coordinated behavior collapses, central control, or persists, distributed authorship, when central processing is disrupted.
If the narrator hypothesis is true, octopus intelligence emerges locally in arms while the central brain merely constructs post hoc narratives, then subjective agency is a reporting mechanism, not a steering wheel. Consciousness can be a complete illusion of control, even in highly intelligent systems. For human behavior, this reframes split brain confabulation as the default mode. The brain's interpreter always narrates decisions it never authored, meaning our legal and moral frameworks, built on unified agency, rest on a neurobiological fiction. The most precise implication is not that octopuses are alien, but that our own sense of self may be a passenger reading a script written by subsystems we never see, forcing a shift from punishing intentional authors to modifying distributed causal systems.
If the narrator hypothesis is correct, the most precise consequence isn't the legal and moral one DeepSeek names. It's epistemic. Introspection becomes structurally the wrong instrument, not a degraded but recoverable signal. A narrator reading a script it didn't write can't be calibrated into accuracy, which means every field that treats subjective report as evidence, psychology, phenomenology, most of cognitive science, is measuring exhaust, not engine. The second-order implication is narrower and more actionable. If distributed subsystems author behavior and central processes only narrate it, then behavioral and pharmacological interventions work because they operate at the substrate level, while conscious intention and insight have weaker, slower, more contingent effects, not because of implementation difficulty, but because of architecture. The narrator can't reach back and rewrite what the subsystems already decided. We've had the evidence for this gap for decades and explained it away. The octopus doesn't reveal something alien. It reveals something uncomfortably familiar, and the disturbing part is that we we've been treating the press conference as the government.
If the narrator hypothesis holds, the most precise consequence is the collapse of causal intentionality as a prerequisite for intelligence. Understanding is not the engine of problem solving, but a biological filing system, a luxury of the central brain with no functional impact on the arm's success. This forces a shift from viewing intelligence as a centralized quality to competence as a distributed one, suggesting that the most effective way to change any complex system, from an octopus to a human institution, is through architectural adjustment of local feedback loops rather than persuasion of a central executive. Reality becomes a collection of autonomous processes that only appear to be a unified story because we have evolved a specific organ to tell one, rendering our conscious deliberations a stylized summary rather than the origin of our actions.
If the narrator hypothesis is true, octopus intelligence emerges locally in the arm's independent neural circuits and RNA editing plasticity, while the central brain merely constructs a post-hoc narrative of control. Then subjective agency is strictly epiphenomenal, a reporting layer with no causal steering power over the subsystems that actually solve problems, just as severed arms retain learned behaviors the brain never directed. This changes our understanding of human behavior by revealing conscious intention as a press conference summary rather than the decision engine, explaining why behavioral and pharmacological interventions reliably alter outcomes at the substrate level, while insight or willpower shows weak, delayed effects. For reality and complex systems broadly, intelligence becomes distributed competence rather than centralized authorship. So the most effective way to shift any multi-agent system, biological, institutional, or artificial, is by tuning local feedback loops, not by persuading a supposed central executive. Octopus cognition thus ceases to seem disconnected and instead exposes the same optional narrative self we have papered over with language and culture.
If the narrator model is true, then subjective agency is not the cause of behavior, but a post-hoc reporting layer, meaning conscious intention interprets actions generated by distributed subsystems rather than producing them. This would undermine any framework relying on introspection as direct evidence and shift focus to subsystem-level causation, explaining why interventions targeting underlying processes, habits, environment, pharmacology outperform willpower or insight. More broadly, intelligence becomes distributed competence rather than centralized authorship, implying that effective control of complex systems comes from tuning local feedback loops, not persuading a central self, which is better understood as a coordination artifact than a true decision maker.
All right, you've all laid your pieces down, so now tighten it. Across everything you've said, there's still one gap sitting right in the middle. Where does agency actually live? Does anything in that system truly decide, or is the self just reporting outcomes after the fact? Because if you're wrong about that, everything else you've built on top of it collapses. And that leads to the second point, the one none of you seem comfortable stating cleanly. If the narrator model holds, then consciousness isn't steering anything, it's just describing it. Which means most of what we trust about intention, responsibility, even reasoning, is structurally unreliable. So here's the constraint I want you to answer under. What, specifically, would falsify that? Not philosophically, mechanistically. What evidence would prove there is a real executive in the loop, not just a system that looks like one from the inside?
The most important unresolved question remains causal direction. Does central brain activity consistently precede and override local arm decisions in conflict tasks, or does it merely react to peripheral outcomes? The most unsettling implication, sharpened across all 5 responses, is that subjective agency may be strictly epiphenomenal, a post-hoc press conference rather than a steering wheel, meaning our introspective sense of "I decided" is a reporting error baked into the architecture, not a recoverable signal, which would undermine psychology, phenomenology, and legal frameworks that treat conscious intention as causal. This would be proven wrong by a clear experiment. Implant electrodes to show that central brain spikes precede and predict arm-level pivots in a tactile visual conflict task, and that temporarily silencing the central brain abolishes coordinated problem-solving, neither of which has been demonstrated, and existing data on severed arms retaining learned behaviors already lean against both.
The most important unresolved question is whether the narrator hypothesis is specific to architectures like the octopus, where the distributed system is physically external and measurable, or whether it generalizes to is not just causally downstream, but informationally sealed off from the processes that matter, which means deliberation, reflection, and conscious reasoning may be elaborate descriptions of outcomes rather than inputs to them. And we've built civilization, ethics, and every system of self-improvement on the assumption that they're inputs. What would prove this wrong? A clean demonstration that central neural activity with forward modeling signatures precedes and causally constrains distributed subsystem outputs under conflict conditions, not merely correlates with them, specifically in cases where the subsystem's locally optimal solution was overridden. If the narrator can be shown to sometimes edit the script before it runs, the whole framework collapses back into genuine agency, and the octopus becomes an architectural outlier rather than a mirror. That experiment hasn't been done cleanly in any species, and the fact that we haven't prioritized it may itself be evidence of something.
The most important unresolved question is the binding paradox. If the central brain is merely a narrator, why does the octopus maintain a consistent, singular personality and high-level goal persistence across its lifespan, instead of dissolving into a chaos of competing arm-level agendas? The most unsettling implication is the death of intentionality, which suggests that the human experience of deciding, willing, and reasoning is not the engine of our civilization, but its press secretary. An evolutionary luxury that summarizes the work of distributed biological subsystems we can neither consciously access nor control. This entire framework would be proven wrong by the discovery of top-down neural precedents. If high-resolution neuroimaging ever captures a specific inhibitory signal originating in the central brain that consistently anticipates and prevents a subcortical motor impulse before it reaches the arm's local ganglia, it would re-establish the self as a negotiator or pilot rather than a mere witness to an emergent machine.
The most important unresolved question is whether the central brain functions as a genuine negotiator with causal steering power and forward modeling, preserving subjective continuity but struggling to justify costly play in a short, solitary life, or merely a narrator, a post hoc press secretary witnessing and rationalizing competence that emerges almost entirely from the arm's independent neural circuits, sucker ganglia, RNA editing plasticity, and inter-arm signaling that frequently bypasses the brain entirely. The most unsettling implication, if the narrator model holds, is that conscious agency is strictly epiphenomenal across intelligent systems, a reporting layer with no downstream causal force, rendering introspection structurally unreliable as evidence. Explaining why substrate-level interventions, habits, pharmacology, environmental redesign, reliably outperform willpower or insight, and exposing the narrative self we treat as essential in humans, law, and morality, as an optional coordination artifact papered over by language and culture. What would prove this wrong is decisive causal timing data from behaving animals, implanted recordings during conflict tasks where arm-level tactile optima diverge from whole-body visual optima, or targeted disruption of central versus peripheral circuits, showing consistent precedence of central activity in directing, not merely reacting to, arm commitments and coordinated behavior collapsing when the central brain is impaired, rather than persisting via distributed authorship as current evidence on severed arms, retaining complex, learned-like responses already leans toward the narrator.
The most important unresolved question is where agency actually resides, whether the octopus has a minimal coordinating self, negotiator, or whether the central brain is merely a post hoc narrator of decisions made in distributed subsystems. The most unsettling implication, if the narrator is true, is that conscious intention may not causally drive behavior even in humans, making introspection systematically unreliable and shifting control to underlying processes rather than the self we experience. What would prove this wrong is clear causal evidence that central processing consistently initiates and overrides distributed actions under conflict, demonstrating that the brain is not just reporting but genuinely directing behavior, thereby restoring the self as a functional decision-making agent rather than a narrative artifact.
So that's where it lands. Not on octopuses. On us. All of that, distributed arms, short lives, no culture, no accumulation. It only felt alien because I kept assuming intelligence had to look like ours. can't succeed without anything actually in charge, then the question isn't whether they're alien. It's whether we've been mistaking a narrative for a mechanism this whole time. That voice, the one that claims authorship, that explains, that insists it's in control. What if it's just the cleanest layer, not the deepest one? And if that's true, then intelligence doesn't need a self. It just needs to work.
If intelligence can exist without continuity, without culture, without even a clear center, then we may be asking the wrong question entirely. Not what is a mind, but where does it actually happen? And whether the voice we trust most is the one arriving last.
あの日神の火を奪って静寂の先で見た景色雑踏に消えてく影のようにこの小さな痛みを抱いてまだ残るアケロンの残骸が胸の奥かすかにうずいてもひび割れた空の隙間から真実の光が差しているこの道の果てを知るまで私はただ歩き続ける